What's the deal with Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council of the Catholic Church? Here's where this episode comes from. I get all kinds of emails from people who are looking into the Catholic Church, or new Catholics, people who've been Catholic for a long time that have questions about the faith. I get these emails, these DMs, these messages on various platforms, and so many of them, more and more these days, are bringing up the divide between people who think Vatican II was a good thing and people who think that Vatican II wasn't valid or was a terrible thing and don't really recognize or appreciate the results of Vatican II. This is so common these days. And I have had emails from people who've said, look, I want to become Catholic, but this thing is so confusing. You guys are fighting about this internally. It seems like there's a huge division in the church over this thing called Vatican II. So what's the deal? Well, I've got Dr. Richard DeClue from the Word on Fire Insitute here today to talk about Vatican II. What's the deal? What was it? What did it do? What did it intend to do? What were some of the results that happened after the council that maybe weren't what the council intended and really shouldn't have happened, but they did? How do we fix and repair those things, and how do we move forward? And really, what was the deal with Vatican II? We're going to try and work through some of the confusion to bring you guys some answers. Because the last thing I want to be part of is this experience of getting these emails and these messages from people who are looking into the beautiful, amazing Catholic faith that we have here, who then are turned away by these talking heads in different parts of the internet, these commentators, these people who are criticizing Vatican II, who are dividing the church, and really, as Dr. DeClue points out, don't really know what they're talking about at the end of the day. So let's clear up some confusion here. Let's remove these muddied waters and move forward. Here's an episode with Dr. Richard DeClue. Fantastic conversation. What's the deal with Vatican II? Here we go. Hey guys, welcome back to the Cordial Catholic. Thanks for being here. Thank you for watching. Fantastic episode for you here today. Richard, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here. We're slowly going through the Word on Fire roster, so yeah, slowly having all of you and your colleagues on the program. Yes. You guys are doing fantastic work there, so we just love it. And this isn't a topic I might normally do, because we don't do the deep theological weeds here in this program sometimes. I'm a convert. A lot of converts watching this show, people looking into the Catholic faith, people who are maybe Catholic and don't quite know what they believe in and learning more about the faith. But it's those people, it's those Christians who are looking into the Catholic faith that I've heard so many times from on this topic. They'll say, hey, I'm looking at becoming Catholic, but I've heard this stuff about Vatican II. And I've heard stuff over here, it's this terrible thing. I've heard stuff over here that it's this great liberalization of the church and we can all do what we want and it's got a very freeing thing.
Right.
I know the truth is somewhere in the middle there, and you're going to help us unpack that. But I want to come at it from this angle because this is a dividing thing within the Catholic Church, and it's something that puts off those potential converts to the church, and it breaks my heart it breaks my heart when I have somebody approach me or email me or send me a message and say, hey, look, this Catholic Church looks beautiful, but what is going on with Vatican II? So you're here to clear up all the misconceptions for us and just pave the way. Yeah. So all those potential converts can just march right into the church and enjoy the fullness of the Catholic Church, right? That's exactly what you're going to do for us today.
Right. Well, yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Small task ahead of you. So I do want to begin at the beginning of this thing and ask you if you can kind of tell us, because some people who are tuning into this program have just no idea what Vatican II is when I say Vatican II, or we say Vatican II. So what was the Second Vatican Council? I mean, just at the very base level, what was this thing?
Yeah, so ecumenical councils have been going on since the 4th century. The first one was the Council of Nicaea in 325. And what it is, it's a gathering of at least most of the bishops, usually, of the world into one place to address certain issues. Very often they're doctrinal issues. So if there's a heresy that's everyone's wrestling with, well, what's the true orthodox position? They'll come together and settle the matter. Sometimes it's disciplinary, and sometimes it's both. So sometimes it's a matter of legislation. So that's what an ecumenical council is, and they have to be confirmed by the Pope. So the Pope, in order to be an authentic ecumenical council, the Pope has to ratify it. The Second Vatican Council was called by Pope St. John the 23rd, and shortly after he was actually made Pope, and that it was somewhat of a surprise because no one expected that. They kind of thought he would be a short interim Pope, and then he probably wouldn't have even a chance to do much. And then instead, he had this inspiration to call the council. So just a little bit of a background to that. There have been several councils, and there had been a Vatican I. So they're named after the location they take place in. So like Nicaea, that was in the city of Nicaea. In this case, the First Vatican Council in 1869 and 1870 took place at the Vatican. That's why it's called the First Vatican Council. Well, it got interrupted. So it did make some very important declarations and even a dogmatic definition, but it got interrupted by a war. So it never finished. It was supposed to do a lot more than it did. And basically, so Vatican II was basically tasked with, all right, let's address some of the problems that even happened since then. Because you're thinking about the late 19th century to the mid 20th century, a lot had happened with the Industrial Revolution, with media, with travel. So there were a lot of advances in technology and other issues and politically. And so the idea is to, all right, let's address some things going on now. But just very briefly, that's what an ecumenical council is. So it's the bishops from around the world gathered together to address certain issues and to teach the faith, and sometimes to issue like decrees on how we should conduct certain things. And so that's what it was. And it's actually the Second Vatican Council is the largest council in the Church's history regarding numbers. It's by far the most bishops attended Vatican II over any other council.
Yeah. So was it tasked to, were there certain things, certain heresies, certain misguidedness happening in the church that it was tasked with focusing on? Or what kind of was the mandate of Vatican II when it began?
So some of the background to this is interesting. So before he was Pope, John the 23rd had actually done like many, many years of work on St. Charles Borromeo's implementation of the Council of Trent. And he was very moved by the efficacy and what that did for the local church that implemented the way that Charles Borromeo had done it. And so he spent I want to say it was over a decade working on the documents from that and reading how that council was implemented by St. Charles Borromeo. And so John the 23rd really was just kind of hoping that we could have a revival. There wasn't like a specific heresy per se. It was more of a pastoral need. He wanted to try to do a couple of things. One, renew the church from within, so revivify her internal life and help bolster her own self-understanding. So what is the church? How is it structured? What's the meaning of that? Talk about the different roles within the church and how they collaborate with one another, as well as how can we effectively engage others, whether they are fellow Christians but not in union with us, whether they are non-Christians, or just the world at large, even the secular world. So there was a missionary bent to it, which was, okay, how can we improve relations with those that aren't Catholic as a step towards being able to proclaim the gospel more effectively? Like, let's try to get rid of some of the animosity that's going on, especially with regards to wars and things like that. Let's try to be more friendly with one another, more charitable, and then hopefully that will pave the way for being able to more effectively proclaim the gospel, and to bring others into the church as well as to provide just, insights to the world at large on how we can solve some problems in contemporary society.
Yeah. It wasn't an attempt. I mean, it happened in the 1960s, right? It wasn't an attempt to, which I think right there, that kind of colors the perspective sometimes, because it's the 1960s. We're the 1960s, right? So
Yep.
It wasn't an attempt necessarily to liberalize the faith. That wasn't what the council intended, despite kind of existing in that a culture which very much was doing that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. You have to kind of have a balanced understanding of it, I think. There was the idea of aggiornamento, which is an Italian word that means updating, bringing up to date. But it wasn't about changing the fundamental doctrine. And this is reiterated by Pope St. John the 23rd and Paul VI. I mean, all throughout, they're like, we're not changing the doctrines or the dogmas of the faith, but let's try to find ways of expressing those truths to our contemporary world in terminology that they will understand. So for instance, instead of using like highly technical scholastic phrases, and doing, very specific formulations, they use more of a narrative approach to the documents, and they try to use more common language or explain things in a way that would be a little bit more understandable and engaging with the readers who are contemporary. So how do we make the faith more understandable to modern man, not modernize the faith, which are two different things?
Yeah, definitely. And what kinds of things then came out of Vatican II that had that in mind? What kinds of things that were produced, and I know a number of documents were written and distributed. What kinds of things did they come out with at this Ecumenical Council?
Yeah, so there were 16 documents of Vatican II. You have 4 that are constitutions, 2 dogmatic constitutions, 1 pastoral constitution, and 1 that's just called a constitution. We don't need to get into the minutiae of the differences, but dogmatic constitutions would carry the most weight. So you have like Dei Verbum, which was the dogmatic constitution on divine revelation, which I think is a just brilliant document. But it kind of was expressing, well, what is revelation? When we say revelation, what is it? Where does it take place? When does it take place? How is it handed on from generation to generation? How does the scripture relate to tradition and to the magisterium? How do those relate to revelation? What is the role of scripture in the church was a big part of it as well. So talking about the continuing validity of the Old Testament, there had been new hermeneutics of biblical hermeneutics that had come out like in the century or two prior. So, well, how do we deal with those? Is there a legitimate use of like the historical critical method? Is it sufficient? Does it need to be augmented by other readings? So it's a brilliant document, actually fairly short. But that was a big part. So that's sort of, to me, is sort of the foundation of the rest of the council. Its major point, I think, is that ultimately Jesus is the mediator and fullness of all revelation. And so it points to Christ as bringing the fullness of truth. And then, of course, that leads naturally into the dogmatic constitution on the church, which is Lumen Gentium, because the church is understood as the body of Christ. Christ is the head of the church. And the church is understood there in Lumen Gentium as being the sacrament of salvation and unity of all people. So it's an efficacious sign that helps bring about that which it signifies, thus sacramental. It's actually a part of the effect of salvation. And so then it kind of goes through and explains the different parts of or how the church is structured, as well as the different levels of magisterial teaching. So it kind of clarifies that, the levels of holy orders, including the episcopacy, So a lot of it's just reiterating certain truths. Now, the episcopacy actually was somewhat actually settled an open question at the time. Then it also dealt with had a declaration of religious liberty. It had documents on ecumenism, which is dialogue between Christians of different denominations, or how the council refers to them as either churches or ecclesial communities, depending. If you want, we can delve into that distinction later. But and then you have interreligious dialogue, which is between Christians and non-Christians. And there was a document about the church's relationship to non-Christian religions. There was also some documents on like the formation of priests, on the episcopacy and religious life and things like that. So it kind of dealt with a lot of internal matters of the church as well as the external relations. And then, of course, Gaudium et Spes was a document on the church in the modern world. And that's the largest document, if memory serves. It's a pretty long document, but it's dealing with all sorts of issues going on in the world and how the church understands them and thinks we should approach them. And then, of course, probably the most well-known and discussed amongst Catholics is Sacrosanctum Concilium. Although I should probably clarify that. Maybe not the most well-known, but it was the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy. And so it had issued principles for a reform of the Latin rite, the Mass, the Latin rite. And so that's where a lot of people saw the biggest changes. Most people associate Vatican II with changes to the liturgy, even though it did a lot more, and that was just one component. That's probably what it's most well known for.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot to dig into there. Maybe we'll start backwards. I mean, at the end of that. I mean, the one thing that strikes me is you start off by saying that the attempt wasn't to revolutionize the church or change the church, to clarify these teachings on these different things. In most cases, it was updating in a sense of re-expressing itself, I guess, to itself, to really work out what we as Catholics believe. I mean, let's start with the liturgy, though, I guess, because, as you said, this is the thing that most Catholics would have seen on the ground kind of emerge from this, I guess, right? And I can't imagine being a Catholic at that time, right? And my understanding is you would have gone to Mass on one weekend, and the next you would have gone again, and it could have looked quite different, or it could have looked quite different pretty quickly. And I mean, that seems like a radical change. What kind of changes did this actually bring about, or was intended to bring about? There's two questions in there.
Yeah.
What changes were meant to happen in the liturgy? Like, what was the attempt for reform there?
Interestingly, and if I'm remembering correctly, it was actually one of the least controversial documents to get passed at the council. It was like one of the most unanimous. Now, most of the documents actually were nearly unanimous, and we're talking like 2,580 to 3 on the votes. I mean, these were very super majorities with the documents. But Sacrosanctum Concilium. So just to back up, so the Second Vatican Council had been prepared for 3 years. So from 1959 to 1962, they had all sorts of work being done to prepare for it. Then it happened from 1962 to 1965. Now, I'm not a liturgical historian or expert in the liturgy per se. I think the first, what we now call the Novus Ordo, or the ordinary form of the Mass, I think that wasn't until like 69 or 70. So there was a few years, because the council itself didn't make changes to the liturgy. It issued principles. So it talked about, well, what is the liturgy? It's the high point of the church's life, right? And then it gave principles for how a reform should be done, but it didn't actually do the changes itself. Now, you can talk about differences between what Sacrosanctum Concilium said and what people experienced on the ground, because even a lot of people that were at the council in support of a reform of the liturgy very quickly got dismayed about what took place. And Pope Benedict XVI, back then Ratzinger, was one of those. and like Louis Boyer and people like that. So essentially, with regards to the liturgy, it did call for the possibility of using more vernacular in the liturgy, because at that time, the Latin rite, because remember, within the Catholic Church, some people don't know this, there's actually like 22 or 23 sui juris, meaning self-governing Eastern Catholic churches that are still in full union with Rome. They're fully Catholic, but they have their own liturgical traditions. And there's sort of like varying degrees. So you have like Byzantine, which includes several others, like Ruthenian is under the Byzantine tradition. And then you have others like the Maronites. Well, by far, the Latin Church, the Roman Rite, is the largest as far as population of Catholics. But it mainly only dealt with that liturgy, not the Eastern liturgies, mostly. Okay, so at that time, the Mass was completely in Latin. So all of the prayers, the readings are even done in Latin. So you have the epistle, you have the gospel, they were proclaimed in Latin. Most people would have a missal, and the idea was they would have the Latin and then their vernacular, like English, on opposing sides or next to each other in columns, so you could follow along in your native language, but you basically then had to read it because everything being said was in Latin. So one of the things that Sacrosanctum Concilium called for was a greater allowance for the vernacular to be used in the liturgy itself, especially in parts of the Mass that change from week to week, like the collects. I think about the opening prayer and the prayer after communion, because those change relatively frequently. So for better comprehension, okay, maybe we can just do those in the vernacular. It's still actually called for Latin to be used for the people to know their responses in Latin. So the parts of the Mass that pretty much remain the same, the ordinary of the Mass, was envisioned to actually remain mostly in Latin, but it was left up to bishops' conferences and things to decide how much vernacular versus how much Latin. What you ended up actually seeing in practice was a lot of times it was like the next day it's all in English, from one weekend to the next in the late 60s or early 70s. And that just kind of threw people for a loop. It also called, it's funny because the document itself actually affirmed certain things that were already kind of the norm, such as Gregorian chant taking pride of place in the Latin Rite as particularly suitable to the Latin liturgy, or polyphony, and the pipe organ as being the most fitting instrument for the sacred liturgy, which might surprise some people because that's probably, the organ's still pretty widely used, but there's a lot of masses that use other instruments and things now that were never mentioned in Sacrosanctum Concilium. So sometimes there's confusion because people think, oh, well, Vatican II said to do this. Well, it's not necessarily the case. So the actual experience on the ground is not necessarily what you'll find in the documents of Vatican II itself. So it's just kind of an important caveat to make.
Yeah, and this is the big thing that I think begins to create this division that you see within the church and that kind of detracts from those who are looking into the church. It's this idea of, okay, so Vatican II said these things, but look what happened, right? And a lot of people will point to things like the guitar guitar masses suddenly becoming a thing. I can think for myself, when I was doing RCAA, which is for listeners and viewers, kind of the program that adult Christians do to become Catholic. I can remember very clearly we had this opportunity to do Eucharistic adoration in the church, which is, again, for listeners and viewers, which is the Eucharist, the host, which we believe becomes the body and blood of Jesus, up there on the altar. And we can go in there and we can kind of pray before that. We believe that Jesus is there on the altar and we can pray. And I was so excited to do this as a convert. And I went in and I said, oh yeah, so we bow down on both knees, right, before we enter the church to show respect to Jesus. And this lovely nun who was a fantastic religious sister, she was wonderful, taught this class. I owe her a tremendous debt. I owe her for teaching me this class. But she came out of this post-Vatican II time, And she said, no, we used to do that. We don't anymore since Vatican II. We don't do that anymore. And I thought, no, wait, because I knew we still did that. I had been studying the faith. I'd watched all these different lectures and videos and read tons of books. But here's this idea that Vatican II did away with these things. That we used to do these things here, we don't anymore. And I learned about this thing called the Spirit of Vatican II. So
Right.
can we kind of unpack that a little bit as it pertains, first of all, to the liturgy, and then we'll talk about other topics as well. But this idea that the liturgy was fundamentally changed or was meant to be really isn't what the council intended, right? That's more of interpretation of the council.
I don't think so. I mean, it did call for some. There's a lot of repetitions in the older form of the Mass that was now called the extraordinary form or the traditional Latin Mass. So it called for, well, let's simplify some things. But yes, so anyway, what am I trying to say? I wanted to highlight one thing. I do want to make an important caveat to what I said earlier about like the pipe organ and things. We do have to keep in mind that the Vatican Council is speaking to the whole church and even the whole world. I'm sure there are tons of like parishes in third world countries that can't afford a pipe organ. So we'd have to be careful. It's like, we can't just look at things through our own lens. So there is allowance for other types of instruments to be used when that's maybe more to a particular place or just more accessible. But it did just make the comment that yes, traditionally the pipe organ is particularly suitable for the Latin liturgy. So I just want to make that caveat. But some places can't do that, and we're not saying that that's wrong. They're doing the best they can. But yes, there was, unfortunately, you had a number of people, especially after the council, that kind of pushed the notion of the Spirit of Vatican II. And what that basically meant to the people using it or appealing to it was that, well, we don't really need to pay attention to the documents and what they actually say. We just need to see it as an event that opened up the church to just kind of do new things. Well, that's not what the documents actually say, though. And so it's a false understanding of the council to give this spirit that is contradictory to the letter. The true spirit of the council is given in the documents, in the texts themselves. And so, unfortunately, that what you were experiencing yourself was not uncommon, and in some places is still common. I think it's getting better now. But there were a lot of people teaching in seminaries and colleges, all sorts of things that were not really in line with the council. So they used the council as somewhat of an excuse and a license to do things not called for by the council, but they were proclaiming that it was in the spirit of the council, even if it wasn't actually backed up by it. And that's not really, it's a shame, because a lot of the stuff that the council called for is amazing and would be very beneficial if you do it faithfully. So yeah, what you're describing, though, is a very common problem. Actually, Dr. Matthew Levering, he wrote the afterword to the Word on Fire Vatican II collection book that contains the 4 major constitutions, and he talks about this, how there were some what we called like religious liberalism, which is distinct from political liberalism, in the decades following the council became pretty rampant and was misappropriating and misrepresenting the council and giving people a lot of false understandings about it. And so we, as well as the likes of him, are trying to overcome that and try to help give a better, authentic understanding of what the council taught and called for.
Yeah, it seems more like that's the spirit of the age than the spirit of the council. I mean, this was within this was the 60s. A lot of parts of culture were liberalizing, if you will, right? And opening up, and things were more acceptable. Mm-hmm. Birth control became widely available. All these kinds of things were happening. It was a spirit of change in culture. I guess that what the Spirit of Vatican II really was adopting was a spirit of the age more than Vatican II, right? Is that safe to say?
Yeah, I would say so. The Spirit of Vatican II very much was. It was like they were trying to get the church to conform to society and currents within the general culture, more so than even being faithful to her own tradition and doctrines. And so this sort of, you're dealing with a lot of liberalism with regards to, well, are dogmas really fixed? Are they just expressions of personal religious experience rather than actually true statements? Absolutely. You had, ideas of, oh, well, we can just read like the history of the gospel, calling into question the historical reality of like the gospels, for instance, and like all these different sort of liberal tendencies that were being pushed in the universities. And it really did a lot of damage, and give a lot of misunderstanding about what the church actually was trying to do with the council. It was very clear if you read the speeches and the documents of the popes who reigned over the council and approved the documents, Pope St. John the 23rd and Pope St. Paul VI. It's very clear that they were affirming the enduring reality of dogmas and doctrines, and not calling for us to throw all that stuff out.
Yeah. So Vatican II is synonymous with the idea of, the Latin Mass this time before, and then Novus Ordo, the new Mass that we see most commonly now in Catholic parishes afterwards, right? And this distinct shift. And so a lot of the people that come out criticizing Vatican II will point to the Latin Mass as this superior thing. Look how much more reverent this is, much more holy, much more solemn, much more traditional, how the church has always done this. This distinct change happened here. So, liturgy is a huge part of the criticism of those who criticize Vatican II as not being a good thing or true thing or a real thing in some cases, an actual valid council. What do we make of that distinction between the Latin Mass and Novus Ordo Mass and the role Vatican II played in that, and that comparison between the two, saying, no, Vatican II is terrible because, look, the Mass was this, and now the Mass is this. Is that fair to say, look, these two things are like this, and so Vatican II is terrible? Is that fair to say? Does that make any sense to make that kind of a point?
I personally, I don't think it is fair to say, because especially if you're talking about in the concrete, what people were experiencing in the pews that they're lamenting, a lot of those things were not called for by the actual council.
Yeah.
So to me, if you're going to look at the council's texts, to judge the council, you have to judge it by the actual texts. So if you're complaining about this particular thing happening in the liturgy that you're seeing at your local parish, and it's not called for in the text, you can't blame the text. So you have to look at the source of where that's coming from. Some of it could be a change in the actual rubrics. Oftentimes it's things that are being done on the local level that are actually still against the rubrics of the Novus Ordo. So for every particular issue that you're dealing with liturgically, you kind of have to find out, well, where is this coming from? Is this actually called for by the rite itself, or is it just being changed at the whim of someone locally? So it's not really a fair thing to say that it's the council's fault. After the council, there were actually commissions in charge of actually implementing things. And then you also had just how they were actually followed or not at the local level. We all hear horror stories about some of the liturgies in the 70s and 80s and stuff that were completely always against the actual rubrics of the Mass, but still were going on. And in some places, you might still see some stuff like that going on. So I think it's just important to be honest about where certain things originated.
Yeah, I guess it's a matter of saying that just because people interpret this a certain way, and you see these bad liturgies exist, and we know they do exist, doesn't mean the council was bad or intended that, right?
Right, right.
And I guess then too is, I mean, what we're seeing is then the fall of Vatican II and the Spirit of Vatican II, in a sense, is that spirit pervaded, you said, in universities and different places, and I guess down to the sister that I met who was brought up during this post Vatican II time. So the schooling she received, the training as
Yes.
a nun she received, would have been possibly, and it was in this case, tainted by the interpretation of the council, right? So is it safe to say there's almost this large swath of Catholics who would have, I don't know, been victims of the Spirit of Vatican II, whether they really
Oh,
knew
yeah.
it or not? I mean, no matter how faithful they would have been to attend Mass and try to study post-secondary level, study the faith, they were almost victims of this Spirit in a sense, right? Because what they received
Yes.
as teaching.
Yeah, because they're just trusting their professors or their teachers, and they're just assuming that what they're being told is accurate. In many cases, it wasn't, and in some cases, I would go so far as to say that it wasn't really like in some cases, those people knew that they weren't being accurate about
Right.
it. They were pushing their own agenda. Okay, they weren't trying to necessarily be faithful to the council. They were trying to push the envelope and go beyond. I mean, you had a series of books coming out like, the need for Vatican III, kind of, I mean, fairly soon after the council itself. You had theologians writing books calling for the church to go well beyond what the council itself said. And those people were teaching courses, encouraging that sort of thing in their students. And that was fairly widespread. Now, one thing that I think is important to realize is that this stuff didn't happen right after Vatican II. Like, there was already some of these things happening in universities and seminaries before the council. Like, there were already these religious liberal movements taking place in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Now, they might have been smaller and not as influential, but they were taking place. But then, yes, in the 60s and late 60s and 70s and beyond, they kind of just seemed to overwhelm the universities and schools. So, yeah, it's unfortunate, but yeah, it was a very widespread problem.
I think too of the problem of how Catholics today, I mean, the reverence, the understanding for something like the Eucharist in the liturgy, right? Eucharistic literacy, if you can put it that way, is so low these days in the Catholic Church, right? Those who understand what the Eucharist is, what the Church teaches about the Eucharist, I feel like in large measure that's going to be a product of this liberalization that happened in the Spirit of Vatican II, and in some of these movements that downplayed elements of the Mass, of the liturgy.
Yeah.
And I think then you'd see those people who point to Vatican II and say, look, this was horrible because you lost all the trappings of, say, the Latin Mass, which would have held the Eucharist at a very high level. You'd have seen people on their knees to receive the Eucharist. You would have seen much more reverence in a Latin Mass versus a Novus Ordo Mass. And then point to the poor Eucharistic literacy that we have these days, and say, look, this is what happened. This is why it was bad, because look, no one knows what the Eucharist actually is. Is there something in there? Is there a grain of truth in there? Is there a lesson to be learned from that, do you think?
I think there is a lesson to be learned. I mean, obviously, in some sense, actions speak louder than words, and the liturgy is the high point of the church's life. The church is most herself when she is celebrating the Mass. And the liturgy, the way that it's celebrated, should reflect the mysteries that are actually taking place. I like to use an example of when it comes to music, just for instance. I think of liturgical music as sort of like a soundtrack. Okay, it's not a concert per se, although some liturgical music can be used as a concert because it's so beautiful. But it's supposed to be matching and helping to more fully express the reality that's taking place, the divine and heavenly realities that are present. If you're watching a movie and the soundtrack doesn't match what's going on, it can ruin the whole experience.
Yeah.
Right? So if the way that the liturgy is not being celebrated is not as sacred and uplifting and awe-inspiring as the actual mysteries that they're meant to express, there's a problem. And if you do sort of downplay the solemnity of the liturgy, it can have very bad effects, because people will say, oh, well, this is no big deal. This is just like any other, like, if it feels more like a picnic than a solemn celebration and worship of the triune God, that's going to have an effect, you know? And so I think it's important to realize Vatican II never called for the liturgy to be done in a non-solemn way. And so it's not fair to blame Vatican II itself. It's also, I think, important to realize that we only experience our own times. And I think sometimes we have a very myopic view of history. It's like we tend to think, oh, after every other council in church's history, things were fine. No, it was actually kind of the norm for after an ecumenical council, there would still be a lot of problems going on in trying to implement it and understand it. I mean, that's why if you look at the first, 7 ecumenical councils, mostly dealing with like the Trinity and Christological dogma, like the central aspects of our faith, there's still confusion going on. I mean, St. Basil the Great describes after the first ecumenical council of Nicaea, like, oh my gosh, like people are interpreting it either by excess or by privation, like completely wrong, and there's fighting going on in the churches in this. Like, he's describing what you often see in the church today as happening back then. So it's not uncommon that, I mean, I've heard it. It's somewhat of just anecdotal, or not anecdotal, but it's sort of a phrase that's thrown around, is that it usually takes about 100 years for a council to actually be implemented. So by the time you get from the council itself to it being settled, it can take a while. I mean, the Council of Ephesus in 431 had to be followed up 20 years later by Chalcedon, because there was still fighting going on about Christology and questions. And then even after then, there were people claiming that Chalcedon was teaching an Nestorian version of which Ephesus had condemned. And of course, it wasn't, but people were misinterpreting Chalcedon. So this isn't really unique to Vatican II, but we tend to just think that way. Like everything, all the other councils were cut and dry, and everyone followed it, and things were great, and liturgies were always awesome before the council, and now everything fell apart afterwards. And that's just not entirely true. But yes, there's certainly, I think you could argue there's been a crisis in the liturgy, certainly on the ground, that has taken place. That did a lot of damage.
Yeah. And I think, going with that theme of the historical myopathy there, the Mass prior to Vatican II wasn't necessarily this rosy, really, really vibrant, really solemn, those are kind of opposite things, but really, really devout thing happening necessarily. Very, very worshipful. Right? The Vatican II said things about liturgy because things had to be said about liturgy. It wasn't this perfect thing that used to happen, and it wasn't this. Right. It wasn't as if the Mass that was celebrated before Vatican II was the exact same Mass for all those years, the 2,000 years almost before that. I think it's a misunderstanding that the Latin Mass was this perfect thing that Vatican II destroyed. Right? There was. I know you're not a liturgist, and I'm not either. I do love the liturgy. But I think that's an important distinction to make, right? It spoke to liturgy because the liturgy wasn't perfect. There were people that needed to understand it better. and to clarify things. We often look at this Latin Mass through rose-colored glasses, right? It was this perfect thing that used to happen, and we want that back. Our liturgy has been destroyed, right? I don't think that was necessarily the case.
Yeah, I think we sometimes don't know. I mean, I've talked to people that were alive back then about it, and their experiences were, I mean, I'm talking about devout Catholics who were very orthodox in their faith that struggled with it.
Right.
They really had a hard time engaging in it. And I also think we can sometimes downplay the abuses that could have been taken and did take place in that liturgy as well. That might not have been as noticeable because most things are done in secret.
Yeah.
But, you know, I've been to several traditional Latin masses. I actually go regularly myself. I do love the traditional Latin mass, but I also go to Novus Ordo. But so you could have a priest, because we think of it as being solemn and more reverent, and it could appear that way externally. But if the priest is saying the prayers silently to where you don't even know, he could be just speed reading through it to get it done. I mean, priests were notorious apparently for back in those days for daily masses they would do a requiem mass because it was shorter.
Right.
And like every day they would do that just so they could keep the time down. A lot of people were just praying the rosary during the liturgy. So they weren't even reading in the breviary, in the missal and following along. They were doing something else while the priest was doing his thing. And they're just sitting there praying the rosary instead and not engaging in the prayers of the Mass, not following. And so there can be this disconnect. And I attend that Mass regularly. And sometimes even I, who can follow along in Latin, am like a page or two off from where the priest is. Because a lot of it depends on how fast you're reading it. And, so it's not always easy to be on the same page. Or even it can actually be very difficult to even witness what's going on and read, because I can't look at both at the same time. So it wasn't perfect. Now, it's a beautiful Mass. It really is. And especially, when you get really good music, you get really good music. It's amazing. But even there can be a disconnect, because the priest might be saying like the creed separately from it being sung, if it's a missa cantata, and then he goes and sits down while the choir's still singing the creed, and then all the people sit down with the priest waiting for the choir to finish. And so, there can be these weird disconnects that take place even in that Mass. And so, a lot of the people that were pushing for the liturgical reforms were still traditionally minded folks. Like Ratzinger, who was a peritus, an expert at the council, had actually been leery of the liturgical movement when it first came out, when he was a student of theology. One of his professors actually helped get him on board with it. But then even when he started seeing what took place after the council, he goes, well, no, that's not what we had in mind. And so what the council itself called for and what the understanding of what a reform meant, and then what they saw taking place in concrete, were often very different things.
Yeah.
But so what I'm getting at with that is even someone like Pope Benedict XVI, who, he as a child, he would actually like try to do German translations of the Latin. As a child, like he loved the missal when he was a kid. He got one of like a child's missal, and then as he would get older, he'd get these more and more advanced versions. Even as a young child, he was very much immersed in the liturgy and loved the liturgy. And so even he thought that the Mass could use some reform. So it wasn't like, no, it's perfect, doesn't need to change. It was like, oh yeah, it actually could. We could improve. We can make improvements on this. The difference is like, well, all right, what does that mean?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, a lot of things have gone on that weren't envisioned, let's say.
Yeah. The other criticism that people will have about Vatican II is that it kind of opens up I don't know if I want to say salvation or the church, the body of Christ, to kind of anybody and everybody, right? You're kind of saved. And this is addressing the idea of addressing these ecclesial communities and non-Catholic Christians. And I mean, the impression you get from certain people in certain sections of the Catholic Church who criticize Vatican II, certainly friends that I have who have brought this to me, or listeners to this show who've asked questions about this, the impression is, well, why do I have to be Catholic? Because I'm saved no matter what. I don't have to be Catholic to be saved. Vatican II taught this. What do we make of that? Because I know, I've read my catechism. I know that's not necessarily what the catechism says, what Vatican II taught. It's an interpretation of that, but often the one that's bandied about. What do we make of the idea of Vatican II opening up the floodgates to everybody being saved and the Catholic Church being kind of unnecessary at this point?
Yeah, it's an important point that's actually very confused. I'm actually planning on doing a course on Vatican II through the We're on Fire Insitute. I'm actually going to be doing a couple of different ones. But because of this question and this misunderstanding, I've actually, right now, the plan is for me to change the way I normally do it. Because usually when I teach Vatican II, I start with Dei Verbum, then I go through Lumen Gentium, Sacrosanctum Concilium, Gaudium et Spes, and then I get into the ecumenism. And then, so I start from the church, for Revelation, the church, and then I go out into the world and ecumenical dialogue, and then interreligious, and then I go outwards. I think I've actually decided for this next course, I'm going to do it the reverse. Because I think if you understand the narrative flow of what the council was teaching, it makes a lot more sense on this particular question. And since this particular question has been coming up a lot lately, I think I'm actually going to change the order of presentation. What the council taught was that basically throughout history, man has been wrestling with fundamental questions. Okay, why is there something rather than nothing? Is there a God? Is there a divine realm? Is there something after this life? How do we wrestle with suffering in this world? Like these really important questions. And it goes through and talks about how in various cultures in different parts of the world, especially in highly developed societies, you ended up getting these more developed religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, and things of that sort, and that they are striving to try to make sense of these mysteries and are proposing different solutions. And what it says is that they sometimes reflect a ray of that truth that enlightens everyone, which ultimately is Christ himself, who is the way, the truth, and the life. It literally says in that same document, the church must always, I think the Latin, I forget the Latin word, but it basically means, sometimes in English it's not translated as strongly as the Latin actually means, but the document sort of admits, okay, they're striving, they often reflect, or at least sometimes reflect a ray of that truth. Nevertheless, the church must always proclaim that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. It's not teaching religious indifferentism. It's trying to acknowledge that, yes, these folks are striving. They often have good intentions. A lot of them have actually a pretty good moral teaching that's similar to our own, that there's these points of contact that we have with them that we can use as the basis for more fraternal, collaboration in dealing with poverty or other issues, and of trying to stop wars with each other and end the violence. So it's trying to acknowledge the good that, and it says that we reject nothing that is good and true in those religions. It's not saying that they are perfect. As a matter of fact, there's several times throughout the documents, I actually had a list at one point, it's pretty long, talking about sin. And it even says, unfortunately, like men often fall into error and are deceived by the evil one, that is Satan. Okay, and sometimes it's intentional because they don't care, they're not really looking for the truth, they're deceived. Because one thing that the council taught was that every human being is called to search for the truth and to adhere to it once it is known. Okay, so that's actually a fundamental universal demand on every human person to seek the truth and follow it insofar as it is known. That's an obligation. So it actually says in one of the documents, I forget which one it was, but that the same thing cannot be said of those who care little for the truth and for seeking these things. So what it's pushing is that there's this common universal search for the truth, or to answer fundamental questions. And different peoples have tried to offer different solutions. There's some truth in them. There's also a lot of error, and unfortunately, they're often deceived. That's why we need revelation, and so that's where Dei Verbum comes in. That it's God Himself has revealed the truth to us, especially in Christ, and so now He is the way, the truth, and the life. He is I'm trying to say, He's the mediator and fullness of all revelation. He has established a church which continues to exist, to subsist in the Catholic Church. Because the church established by Christ is the Catholic Church. Okay. Now, what it says about salvation is basically the same thing that other popes have said before the council, which is it's possible, due to invincible ignorance, that someone has not come to an explicit knowledge that Christ is actually God incarnate and died for our sins, and that he established the Catholic Church as the means of salvation. So if you're inculpably ignorant, that means you're ignorant because without any fault. Now, you can be ignorant with fault. Again, if you're not seeking the truth. Okay, that's not an excuse. But there could be reasons why someone who doesn't know that this is true, that the Catholic faith is true, that Jesus really is the way to the Father, that God could be offering grace, and that person could be responding to that grace, to where they're not going to be damned for not knowing. Okay, so, but even then, they're still somehow connected to the church if that's taking place, because if you're connected to Christ in grace, you're connected to the church. You can't be connected to Christ and not the church. The two are inseparable. Just as a husband and wife become one flesh, Christ, the bridegroom, and the church, the bride, are one flesh. If you're united to one, you're united to the other. So what it says is, yes, it can be possible. There can be individual people who are not Catholic, who are perhaps not Christian, that might still end up being saved. But it's not because their religion is just as good as the Catholic faith, or just as true, or just as high of a means of salvation. It's simply, well, God in His liberality desires the salvation of all. He also desires that everyone come to the knowledge of the truth. But he judges individuals based on what was possible for them and how they were responding in their life. So it's possible. But it still teaches very clearly, especially in Lumen Gentium, that the church is necessary for salvation, and it very explicitly states, if someone knows that the church was established by Christ as necessary for salvation, and either refuses to enter into her or to remain inside her, such a person could not be saved. So it's actually, Ratzinger actually dealt with this question before he was Pope as well, on the question of salvation outside the church. And it's one thing he kind of says often, he's like, a lot of times when the church is dealing with these things, it's not, our main concern is not to sit here and think, well, what about that hypothetical person over there? The reality of it is, as he himself stated, we know the truth, so we have to follow it. It's not, you can't just leave and go do something else. It's every person is called to adhere to the truth insofar as they know it.
Yeah.
And that truth is Jesus Christ, and the fullness of that truth is in the Catholic Church. And so if you don't continue that, then you will be damned, basically. It even says that, to Catholics to beware of this, that because we've been given such a great gift of having all of the sacraments and the fullness of the truth and the teaching authority of the magisterium to help us on our way, that if we do not persevere in charity, remember the theological virtue of charity is important here, then not only will we not be saved, we'll be all the more severely condemned. So it's not just, okay, I'm in the church, I'm fine. It's like in the church, and you got to live it.
Yeah.
So it's some people, none of those things I just told you sound very liberal and progressive and everything's hunky-dory, or, and everyone's saved and don't worry about it, is it? I mean, it's pretty strong statements. If you know the church is the true church, established by Christ, necessary for salvation, and you refuse to enter or stay in, and I think the or stay in is becoming very important nowadays. There's a lot of people being tempted to leave. They could not be saved. That's not a liberal religious indifferentism teaching. And so we have to kind of understand that. It's saying, yes, there's truths out there. People are trying. There's people out there that maybe have never even heard the gospel, living in places that are not Christian, like hardly at all, that are still trying, and they have some truths. But there's also a mixture of errors, and we're called, because, again, there was a missionary call. There's a call to, the council was very big on missionary activity. We need to try to bring these people into church, bring the truth of the gospel to these people so that they can have the same benefit we have, which is the fullness of truth. So it wouldn't push missionary activity if it thought it wasn't important, or it thought that all other religions were just as good or valuable or as true. No, objectively speaking, the Catholic faith is the fullness of truth, and it has the fullness of means of salvation. Because of that, we want to bring it to those that don't have it. And so, yeah, the Second Vatican Council was not at all into this whole religious indifferentism thing. It was for, you don't have to be a jerk about it, right? Like, be kind to them, don't, be kind to them, like, befriend them, help, like, that's how you're going to help bring them the gospel. Like, if you can just push people further away just by saying, by the way, because you're, this, that, or the other thing, you're going to hell, and you have no, you got to meet them where they're at and help bring them. Like, there's a pathway to discipleship and bringing people in that, is important. And if they don't get the sense that you care about them, and you're just, belittling them, that's not going to be an effective means. So it was calling for us to kind of like, hey, let's be charitable when we're trying to convert people here. And also listen to them. Like, if you're trying to convert this person and you mean it, you're actually trying to convert them. You're not just trying to puff up your own chest and say, oh, look how brazen I am. If you really care about that person's soul, you're going to listen to their objections or concerns or questions. So that's where the dialogue comes in. You're not going to help them come into the church if you're not willing to listen to where they're at and therefore be able to help bring them in.
Yeah. Well, that's a fantastic segue. And I want to squeak in one more question. I know we're short on time, but I have to ask you because
I have time if we have to go over. I don't know if you do, but I have time. I'm not worried about time.
Well, this is the thing, right? Because you talk about that pathway of discipleship and listening to people and walking with that person who's a potential convert to the Catholic faith. And this is what kills me, because these are the emails that I get that say, look, I want to become Catholic, but I Googled like becoming Catholic, or I put it into YouTube, and what do I get? But these videos, these different talking heads, different people out there questioning the validity of Vatican II. And whether or not then even the Pope is a real Pope, and then popes that followed Vatican II are real popes, and all this kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. It all stems from, was this even a valid council? Because it wrecked the church. This is the perspective that these people come from. It's more and more prevalent in the church these days. Even then when I came in 6 years ago, I didn't find that stuff. It's grown since then. And you guys at the Word on Fire Institute are putting out this fantastic, beautiful copy of the documents of Vatican II to say, hey, look at these, actually read these and see what they say, which is a good cure for this sickness, I think. What do you say in a nutshell to those people, though? I mean, I don't want to speak to the people who are saying these things. I want to speak to the people who are watching, who are emailing me and watching this video, who are potential converts who punch into the Google machine, Catholic Church,
Right.
and find these
Yep.
videos. What do you say to those people who find these other people saying Vatican II wasn't valid,
Right.
and are left kind of confused? What do we say to them?
I'd say be careful of your sources. You don't. I've been pushing this notion that you can't have a soap opera approach to ecumenical councils. You'll get a lot of these videos out there saying, "Oh, well, this person who's at the council was a bad dude. He was involved in drafting this certain text. Therefore, are you going to go back and do that with every single ecumenical council in history? Because even Vatican I, one of the main authors of like Dei Filius, defining papal infallibility, it was discovered later, had some bad things going on in his life. So a council's document is not based on the personal holiness of every single person who's involved writing it. If you're Catholic, you believe that the church is led by the Holy Spirit, that it has a real teaching authority, okay, and that the Spirit will prevent errors and heresies from being taught by ecumenical councils. So don't listen to just people on YouTube and doing blog posts that are like spouting off, because I've seen a lot of those things too, and unfortunately they're just woefully either ignorant or misinformed. And when I see some of the videos that you come across, or even blog posts, you're just like, that's not even close to being true. So first of all, find a good theologian or a priest or some like that knows the faith, that's orthodox, that's prayerful, has a good prayer life, and learn from them. And first of all, honestly, it's very easy. Just pick up the catechism.
Yeah.
The catechism is one of the best things that happened since the council. And it's just read that, because that's what the church teaches. Okay, that's the best place. If you want to know what the church teaches, look at the catechism. If you want to know what the council itself actually taught, then read the documents. Now, there's 16 of them, I know, but it's worth the time. And at least read the major ones. Like we do have, like this just came out recently, the Word and Fire Vatican II collection, right? Very beautifully done. We're actually going to have a reading plan going along with it that takes you through the entire book in a 7-week. I created a reading plan with readings for 5 days a week over 7 weeks to get through it. And hopefully we'll be able to do some videos that will go along with those readings so people can understand it better. Now, don't get too alarmed at this. This is just the four major constitutions, right? There will be, I think there's going to be another edition with the rest of them later, I think. But this is great because this includes a foreword by Bishop Robert Barron, which is excellent, kind of talking about what you were talking about with a lot of the recent controversies over the council that have sort of just that seem to have sprung up again recently in the last year or so. You've got the opening address by Pope St. John the 23rd. You've got an afterword by Dr. Matthew Levering, who's one of the best young theologians out there today. And then interspersed within each of the documents, there's actually, let's see if I can show you an example. So you have the actual text, and then interspersed throughout the text, you'll have these other, like here. It's where that text has been referenced in a subsequent document by like a pope. Like here we have a reference, Dei Verbum number 10 is being referred to in Pope Benedict XVI's document Verbum Domini. So it'll actually give you little snippets from the conciliar and post-conciliar popes showing the continuity of the teaching from the council to today. And then sometimes also commentaries written by Bishop Barron about that same text. So this is the four constitutions, but also with some supplementing material. So like you'll see Bishop Barron's reflections on this, like on Dei Verbum 8 through 10. He has a short little reflection on the meaning of that. And so you're getting the documents plus with some commentary and excerpts from other magisterial texts affirming the teaching of the council. And it's really well done. And we're going to try to give other helpful resources for understanding the council as well. But don't just listen to random people, on the internet. Like, try to get good sources. There's some good books on Vatican II out there, like Father Matthew Lamb and Dr. Levering have, I think, at least 2 books out on Vatican II that have contributors to them. So read those. Father Jared Wicks, who actually helped me a lot with my own dissertation, has several articles, but also a book on Vatican II that I'm actually reading through now. It's really good. And so try to get trusted sources. Don't listen to random people, just spouting off. It's not helpful. It's going to be more discouraging, and you're probably going to get a lot of disinformation, and it's going to make it more confusing because you're going to hear a lot of falsehoods about the council.
Yeah. Well, that sounds fantastic. I think your tip with the catechism is fantastic because it's the same advice that I give to people who are dealing with kind of anti-Catholic apologists who say, "Oh, the Catholic Church believes this, this, and this." I always say, well, go to the Catechism and read that for yourself. It's the same in many of these. Read the Vatican II documents, read the Catechism, learn what the Church actually teaches. I mean, it's such an easy solution. It almost seems too easy, but there it is. Read those sources, right?
Yeah, and the Catechism is great because you'll get quotes from the council itself, so you'll see how the council taught on that issue. There's also a lot of quotes from the church fathers and from scripture, which the council itself does a lot of too. So even if you look at the footnotes of the conciliar documents, you'll see references to past encyclicals and ecumenical councils and church fathers and scripture. Like, it's the sources for the documents are very rich and very Catholic. So
yeah. Well, Dr. DeClue, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah,
and this
problem.
conversation, I love this kind of stuff. Hopefully listeners will love it too. I'm sure they will. You're at the Word on Fire Institute. You've given us a little sneak preview of things coming down the pipeline. Anyone else you want to point people to follow what you're doing other than that?
Well, most of the work I'll be doing will be for the Word on Fire Institute itself. So you can sign up and become a member of that, and you'll have access not just to stuff I'll be doing, but we have a whole team of full-time and adjunct fellows that offer great courses. You also end up getting access to Word on Fire Digital, which includes like Bishop Barron's videos and lessons and talks as well. So you get a lot, and plus a quarterly journal called Evangelization and Culture. That's excellent. So I recommend people sign up for the Word on Fire Institute. We do courses, we do seminars, all sorts of resources that are available through that. So I think it's very worthwhile to do that.
Awesome.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Sounds fantastic. Well, thank you. Thank you for being here. I want to say God bless you. God bless the work that you are doing for the church. And thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.